press record. So as a quick introduction, Grounded are an organisation that aims to bring quality agricultural products from healthy landscapes to market. I hope I'm saying this right. They do this by creating partnerships with farmers to enable consumers to invest in this process as well. A little bit stolen from your website. and I'll let you introduce yourself a bit more, but we're really interested to hear about your holistic approach, the experiences that you've had with farmers and the landscapes that you're working with, and also if you could tell us a little bit more about your challenges. But I'll allow you guys to introduce yourselves first, and then we can go on to hear more about your.
Okay, so thank you all for joining this session. So I'm Gijs from the Netherlands, Dutch. We are in Cape Town together with Steffi. We work a lot together in the landscapes, and they said today we're going to chat a bit about what Grounded is doing in these landscapes, and we want to zoom in a bit again on based from our perspective of what role we take in the landscape. Obviously, we also develop again our own vision on what a holistic landscape would be. And I think it's what I want to do today is to zoom in a bit on what Grounded is doing and to show you all the difficulties and challenges we go through to just work on basically a small aspect of within a landscape. Everywhere Grounded is working, we're just doing a small part. And obviously I will tell you a bit more, but before we start, I'll also give you a short introduction of Grounded. We are a Common Land spin-off, and I think some of you might have heard Common Land's also part of the network, is also a landscape restoration NGO. They are more involved in the larger wider landscape restoration projects. Whereas Grounded, as a spin-off as Common Land, we started as an organization to take on business development in a landscape. We are no longer that organization. We've evolved over time due to a lot of circumstances. We've evolved into and grew into a certain direction. We've let the world and the projects take us to where we are today. And I think over the last years, we really re-strategized, redeveloped our vision, and we are super curious to test that with you. And we want your honest, critical opinion, preferably in a Dutch way. So you can be open, and even Steffi, though from Namibia, can handle that as well. Personally, I have more of a business background, but Steffi more of a geographical background. So she thinks much more holistically than me, and I will do the first part of the presentation explaining a bit about what Grounded is doing, and then Steffi will take on more of the holistic landscape managers, our vision on the holistic landscape planning, basically because she actually understands it much better than I do. Our roles within Grounded may be nice. I'm one of the directors of Grounded, partnered up with my colleague Tekla, who founded Grounded 5 years ago, and I partnered up with Tekla August 2016. So just had our 30th anniversary, and Steffi is one of our what we call landscape strategists. So actually the person that takes a leading role within the landscapes. And I'm going to share my screen for a presentation. We normally don't really have presentations, but we now have booklets. We like the detail, so it's not really a nice presentable form, but there's a lot of text, but it helps me guide me through the story a bit. In short, Grounded, what it is we're doing and what is complex about it is, on one side you have Grounded as an organization, and on the other side we have the landscape companies that Grounded develops within these landscapes. So it's going back and forth when I talk about landscape companies and about Grounded and the relationship between them. I will zoom in on that later on, but to give you a short understanding, Grounded is an overarching organization that develops landscape companies, and we have an in-house support group to support these companies with challenges that every of those companies face, like organic certification, logistics, financial management, etc. Then the landscape companies we set up, so switch again to the landscape companies, are organizations that are basically a partnership between farmers, grounded, and investors. These landscape companies, they attract finance. They are companies, independent companies. They attract finance, invest in the farmers in the transition to regenerative farming. They buy the produce from farmers, process it locally, and sell it. So, and there's a constant relation between the landscape companies and grounded. But let's start. See if I can move this slide. Yeah, I want to skip that first one immediately, but why we do it and where we come from. As said, we are a spin-off of Commonland, and that's still very much core of our thinking, our beliefs, and our inspiration. Commonland is about holistic landscape restoration, but what we see as grounded and why we actually started, and in our first project in South Africa, is that in almost every place of the world, it's agriculture that drives landscape degradation. So you see a graph that's overcultivation, it's overgrazing, or deforestation, but within the category of deforestation, 99% of the deforestation is also caused, in the Amazon or in Russia or whatsoever, or in Malaysia, it's palm oil, it's soya, it's rubber in Congo, whatsoever. So everywhere you see that agriculture is the main driver of landscape degradation. So in order to restore landscapes, we think we need to focus on actually tackling that challenge before you can even start thinking about restoring a landscape or think about conservation. Your economy needs to work. Well, and Steffi will zoom in a bit on that later, but we take on one of those pillars of that economy, so the crop farmers, and with them, we're going to develop new businesses that are hopefully better in line and fit the landscapes better. And therefore, we often call it as restoring a balance between agriculture and nature, because we believe every rural landscape needs to serve nature, but it also needs to serve the people that live there. So within the landscape, we're working really closely together with farmers, NGOs, funders. That's what allows us to have a positive impact, to understand the landscape. We are a business development company, so we rely a lot on our partners in the landscape when it comes down to knowledge, what we call landscape mobilizers, so understanding the social systems in a landscape, doing the research in the landscape. So I think that is important to keep in mind. What we do, again, I think I started with that, so that one I skip because we zoom in later on. So within the landscape, what Grounded wants to achieve and what our direct partners are once we are really operating is obviously the environment. That's one of our main goals in improving soil quality when you talk about on-farm soil quality, but also think about how can we protect biodiversity, where do we farm, where don't we farm, can we even create buffer zones with farming around natural areas that somehow our Commonland calls them mixed zones. So for example, can we crop with indigenous plants and mimic almost the natural areas as a buffer zone between the commercial apple farming areas and the natural areas. Obviously farmers are our main client group. It's all about the farmers for us, so we normally wear the farmer's hat, and for them it's better soil, better income, less risk. Always work, as said, always work in close collaboration with the NGOs, but we also need strong relationship with the people buying the produce from us. That determines growing it is one thing, but you also have to sell it. And we have very strong relationship with our investors that often have a different we present them a different opportunity than other opportunities, but it also involves different criteria. So our investors stay on board for a longer term, especially with this regenerative agriculture. It takes a longer transition to go from one crop or one system to another. So it's quite a different proposition to these investors. And this is, I think, important because this is always a bit tricky to understand, and that's the relationship between Grounded and the landscape companies. And so you can always ask a bit more clarification after this section. So please feel free to do that. But we set up the companies, the landscape companies. We look at high value crops that we can cultivate, work with the farmers, see what they have, what don't they have. We look at models that, as Steffi always calls it, alleviate the pressure on the landscape. So can we go from goat farming, from overgrazing, to a system that actually suits the landscape much better? So in the beginning, Grounded is doing the planning, but the landscape companies eventually, they provide the services to the farmers, they provide the capital to the farmers, they buy the produce from the farmers, they support them in the training, etc. And Grounded slowly evolves from that. In the development phase, we slowly go from supporting the landscape company, versus in the beginning when Grounded comes in and there is no company, we work with the farmers, and later on that goes over to the landscape company. Grounded eventually still works with the companies to develop new projects, to do the strategy, to constantly update that as the company grows, continuously support it. So we have if you go to the last part, we do Grounded as for example, an international sales team. And we have several landscape companies providing a range of products, essential oils, dried herbs, spices. We operate in the food ingredient sector. But you see that a lot of these, in the products we focus on, there's a lot of similar buyers. So, for example, our landscape companies that we support, the different ones, we can serve the same buyers. So it's actually quite efficient to have one person in the Netherlands that's doing the sales and marketing on behalf of multiple of these companies. And it also helps because those buyers and those customers we have, they can get multiple products eventually from Grounded. So that's an example of how these synergies work, and what's the value proposition from Grounded in later stages to these landscape companies. We, for example, have standardized budgeting systems for these landscape companies. They are relatively similar on some aspects. They're very different in others, but for the things where there's a lot of similarities, shipping international containers, HACCP certification, organic certifications, all things where Grounded plays a role in supporting these landscape companies. And that helps basically these landscape companies to focus on production. And if you get a very good product and you can sell it, then you often have a business model. So that's what we all try to bring together. So it's almost like we slowly growing into this incubator organization that startups and supports landscape companies. Another example is investors. If you do a startup, there's no track record. But with Grounded, we can show that despite we setting up new companies, we do have some form of track record in this process, which is for many investors a rather unique opportunity, helping investors that normally wouldn't consider this early stage investors to do step in at an earlier stage. Our landscape, these are basically what are key features of what we are doing and what is Grounded altogether. So building smart partnerships, we think very carefully what crops to select that can be marketed internationally, locally. The regenerative agriculture is a very strong aspect of what we do, and that's universal through all our landscape companies. In order for it to work, you really have to look closely into the value chain you operate in. For example, in the honey bush, we can really take out one or two steps in that chain. So it's literally the traditional story of shortening the supply chain. It's not always that easy, but in some cases, it really provides an opportunity. As I said, the in-house support group that Grounded has, that understands landscape companies, does the financial management, logistics certifications, and lastly, again, the marketing and sales channel. Told you a bit about that as well on the road. This is more of the impact we want to have in the landscape. What we do as a group. I think Grounded, there's two types of impact. It's the direct impact that we're having, which is super important on an on-farm level, farmer income level, product quality level, economy level. So we can really be a significant part of contribution to the local landscape economy. But then there's also the indirect benefits, and Steffi will talk a bit more about that later. But it's for us, it's indeed soil building for the farmers. It's giving them more income, and these are just a couple of points. And the optimizing value chain, yeah, the value chain is important because it allows us eventually because the landscape companies take on an active part in that value chain, it allows us to play around where the profits are being made in that value chain. It allows us, by efficiently doing it, to transfer some of the extra value created in this process to the farmer. And from a farmer perspective, there's two things important. It's income, but maybe more so important is risk, and making sure that the farmer has less risk, because that's a bit of a technical story, I won't go into that, but for farmers, eventually over a long period, farming might make profit over time. We all need food, so we need the farmers to work, but the challenge there is that 2 or 3 years can really kill off a farmer, whereas over 20 years he would maybe make a profit. 3 or 2 years could really kick him off. So risk is a really important part. And this value chain approach, also working with these investors, really allows us to decrease the risk, and especially in the transition period. And again, the ingredient portfolio. So over time, we focused on certain crops. We find it very hard to compete in an environment where there's low value, high volume crops, maize or etc. And we can really compete and have higher margins in the more specialty industries where we can specialize. So we focus on crops that are high value, low volume, especially after processing. Crops then can be locally processed, non-perishable crops after processing, so that we can ship around to places in the world where we can get the most value out of them. Essential oils, herbal tea, dried spices. Also because for many, for example, small farmers or smaller farmers, they can't compete in an environment where there's large industrial farming provides the cheapest products. But in this industry, for us, it really provides us to give extra value, but it also allows you can compete in a smaller scale. But maybe with 50 hectares, you're the biggest niche producer organization in a country like South Africa. So it really allows us to stand out and makes our proposition better. And it's hard to get established in such an industry, but since we're doing it in multiple places, we have connections to those buyers. Again, it helps us to more easily develop these niche companies. And last but not least, I think I want to end with this, this part is, in the end, it's all about product quality. We spend a lot on what we believe in better soils. It starts there, so this is where it starts. Better soils leads to better products, and we believe regenerative agriculture leads to better soils. If you do it properly, it's not so easy as it sounds. But what is super important for us as Grounded, for our landscape companies in the end, is to have a good product. And nobody in the world is buying a product just because it's sustainable, just because it's organic. For example, in the Netherlands, there's this wonderful chocolate brand. They make slave-free chocolate. They sell their chocolate because it's brilliantly marked and it's super good chocolate. And I buy their chocolate amongst the top-class chocolates because it's more sustainable and better story than the other brands. But first and foremost, people choose product quality. What does it do for me? What does it do for my health? And I think it's important to understand that we can't rely on just the story. And I think that's for everybody to understand that it takes a lot of effort to make a better product. There's a lot of people competing. So in order to set up a company or any company, it's super challenging, let alone to do it in an area that might be even more challenging. So we as Grounded and the landscape companies, we really have to become super good in making better products and seeing where our qualities lie. And I think if you go through all these efforts, all the regenerative agriculture, one of the things you can distinguish yourself is to provide you a better product. So for example, with honeybush tea, we don't choose the teas that we grow in one of the projects. We don't choose the tea that gives you the highest yield. We focus on the tea that gives you the highest quality. So that we're hoping that we can always see that the best quality is always being sold first before you go down. So it's risk thinking, it's everything is in that. And that's what I try to bring into our culture as an organization, that in the end, everything we do is nice. All the things we do are brilliant, but they can only be brilliant if we get a good product. And that's the business model, whatever it is. So, too much talking from my side. Are there any questions before we go into the second part, where Steffi, from our experience of developing these companies, are there any questions on how we, so far, before Steffi goes into what our vision then is on a holistic management, on a holistic landscape?
If there are no questions, so we just thought it would be nice to break, because this is really about the operations of how we work. So if anybody has anything regarding that, here we go.
There's a question from Thomas. Have you seen?
Yes, we see. We're reading it now.
Just read it out? Or?
Oh, yeah. You can read it out.
So Thomas says he can't unmute, but he was wondering if you can talk a bit about the scale of these companies, how many farmers do they serve, the area covered, etc.
That's a super good question. It's one of the things we struggle, we've talked about a lot over the last couple of times. So the first company was in a rather remote setting in the Baviaansveld, where we work with only 4 farmers. Now goes into 60, 70 hectares of essential oil farming, but with a huge reduce of the extensive goat farming, or intensive goat farming, but on a large scale. So the number of hectares where there's reduced goat farming pressure is in the thousands of hectares. In other projects, we're going to work with more farmers. In Zambia, for example, where we really want to work with small-scale farmers, we think about, there was a project with about 4,000 or 5,000 farmers, and we want to focus on setting up a new company with the top 2 or 3% of the farmers there. The scale of the companies, we think about the companies needs to have in 5 or 10 years time. Between that period, they need to go to 5 to 10 million euros revenue in order to make all of the effort going in and all of the means of investments going in to make that work. So that's a bit of the targets that we're having for the companies we're currently developing. I think our first company has a bit of a different setting. And we have had the opportunity to learn a lot from that. But obviously, while doing it, you also better understand the criteria for the new companies we're setting up. Investments more in the range of between €500,000 and €1 million in the first stage of investments. Later on, going up to propositions of 5 or 10 million euro investments, depending on the size of the company. Sometimes the revenues can go up over time. But again, we started 3 years ago, so we never made it to the 5 or 6 year time of our first companies. But for now, we think the revenue potential should be 5, 10 million euros, 5 to 7 years, but probably that's the minimum. So it can be that we have projects where we think a projected revenue 10, 20 million euros on a longer period. So hopefully that gives a bit of a perspective of the things we're looking now at this stage. And thanks for your question, Thomas. I hope it answered it. Let me see.
We also have one more question from Raphael, but you may be answering that later down the line, about how you get buy-in from farmers and what are the key ways of building trust in the model.
Yeah. No. That has multiple answers. So, but just to highlight a few, we so far always work with farmers in an area where there's always NGOs working, where we have strong partners. So already we tap into the relationships that our partners have on the landscape. Secondly, we have further down the line, obviously it's a lot of talking with farmers, going back and forth, understanding the model, understanding their opportunities, but also understanding their risks. I think that's super important. See if you can slowly build in, so don't transition farmers all at the same time and transition 100% of their farm. So slowly do pilots, Start small, test and show it works before you scale. And maybe more, the landscape companies have quite an inventive governance system where farmers get a profit share. And we are now working on new government systems where farmers have a say in the company. So the ownership is almost shared between farmers, grounded, and investors. It's a bit more complex because traditional shareholding to farmers is super complex, super costly, and it works at many adverse effects. I'm more than happy to discuss it because it's one of the things I'm passionate about, but not for this presentation. But so we have all these things to work with farmers, and normally how it works, if we do one deal with farmers and the landscape companies pay them for the raw materials on day one, and especially after we even give them a bonus after a couple of months, when we sell the product, because that's one of the mechanisms we use to transfer part of the profit to the farmers. As soon as we got one or a couple of farmers that we have a relationship with, that then the word spreads, and then things go fast, and then it turns from we going to the farmers coming to us. But I think very important is to take it step by step, take it slowly, be open about the risks. For example, we never work with farmers that can't take the risk of a first stage project because we can't help them after that. So it's all things combined that we do, that we implement to do that. So I hope that answered it a bit. Let me open the chat screen again.
Yeah, there's a couple more actually, if there's still time. James is wondering about whether you grow the landscape companies from scratch, and whether they need to be homegrown, based on initiative from a.
Yeah, James, thanks. Actually, I can't brag about it, but our first growth strategy of Grounded has just been opportunity driven. One project led to another, and then we said, okay, we don't gonna scale anymore. And we ended up in 3 landscapes in the beginning, just out of coincidence. We had a good connection with partners, and we started to build landscape company from scratch. But only as of early this year, we said, okay, now we feel confident again to grow. We've made many mistakes, we've learned it, we adapted it, and sometimes we had to stand with all the people on the wheel. I don't know what that English expression is, but we have to all stay on board to work really hard to make things work. Now for the first time, we started to explore new opportunities. And we were actually super surprised by the amount of amazing initiatives that are happening, that are doing well, where we can tap into, but where our proposition is still super valid. So a lot of NGOs that have a lot of successful projects, but don't know how to take it forward, how to scale, how to build businesses around those successful initiatives. So actually, we must have done that years ago, but we're far from perfect, and so yes, now it all seems logical, but we were not that smart in the beginning. Shall I do the same? Okay, then Kamal, sorry. Is it okay if we see if you can answer your question after the second part? I hope you're not angry with us. We try, otherwise I will definitely try to answer you in person. Yeah?
Yeah, I think so. Unless there's any other burning questions, then we'll just do the rest of them towards the end so that we have a chance to go through the next section, because it's also actually what we want to get out of you lot a little bit more. Some of your thinking around these questions. So,
yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
There we go. So before I speak on this slide, just to summarize a little bit what Clay said, is that our main focus is to work with farmers in landscapes that are pressured or degraded, and to provide them with the opportunity and enable them to transition to regenerative farming that works better within that landscape context. And so we do that together with the landscape companies, which we build. And that's really because we identify a solution that we think fits in well with the landscape, and together these two entities can best deliver that solution. What we think the main output is of our work in these landscapes is the creation of geographic and economic space for the farmers to have the economic space to invest in their soil, to take care of their resources, and to improve their livelihoods ultimately. And for the geographic space to be created for either external NGOs or restoration initiatives to take place in that landscape, or for conservation to be maintained and supported by whoever is living in that area and whoever stands to benefit from those natural resources. And of course, what that means is that it fits in within the landscape context, even though we play a very, very small role. So what I want to talk about now is a little bit how our approach fits in to rural development and how we understand economic development in a landscape context based on a resource-based economy. So, I think everybody here is probably well aware of all of the different kinds of challenges that people face on the landscape, revolving around the degradation of their resources, conservation issues, climate change issues, poverty issues, the poverty trap, being locked without opportunities to move away or to better utilize what is available, and also some constraints in the mindsets of development and human rights provision. Often we're talking about people providing specific aspects rather than developing opportunities for them to grow and become available naturally. So hopefully, and probably most people here agree that a holistic landscape vision and approach is a good way to solve these challenges. And just to kind of clarify, what is the holistic landscape vision or approach? It's really taking into account all of the different pressures and opportunities, the different natural resources, the different people, the infrastructure, and looking at a set of governance that upholds and promotes the opportunities and safeguards some of the vulnerable aspects of a landscape, so that you end up with resilient economies, resilient people that have opportunities, and just a generally a good quality of life, space to be able to make good decisions that will benefit them in the long term. And you can talk about resilience, reduced vulnerability, or sustainability, but I think all of those features speak to the same end. So we all kind of, I think, can agree that this is a good approach, and very, very seldom do we come across anybody that we work with or anybody on the landscape that doesn't think that that's the right way to do things. But we still feel that there's a constraint in executing this approach that we can easily put down on paper and we can easily discuss with a set of like-minded practitioners. So I mentioned it before, but we really focus on the idea of good governance, a system that helps align all of the different enterprises, organizations, opportunities, activities in a landscape, both in terms of unlocking them and safeguarding them. And then I'll just jump to number 3. That's we talk about environmental and social safety nets. In many cases, those are provided by societies themselves or by local governments, and in the African context and elsewhere in the developing world, often by NGOs. But now more and more people work towards having long-term enterprises that can utilize natural resources in a sustainable way to improve rural areas, so landscapes, if you will. And we are one single such enterprise, and we really focus on agriculture. But even within agriculture, what we've realized is important is that we can only afford to invest heavily in the top performing farmers, because we want to invest in an economic growth that's not about subsistence farming, that's not about providing equal opportunity to everybody there, but providing a real opportunity and a really strong proposition to the farmers who have the capacity to grow and perform commercially, so that they have, for generations to come, a viable business interest that can help them to invest in their soil, in their land, and in their landscape. So we think about it in a little bit of an 80-20 breakdown, where we think that 80% of the inputs in one specific sector need to go into, say, 20% of the people who are interested in that sector. And those are just round numbers, obviously, and they differ in many different areas and different contexts. But, if you look at any other development, if you look at any business anywhere in the world, 80% of the inputs go into the top 20% of the business leaders. Similarly, in any city, you would never imagine that people all based on a geography would have the same profession. And so we try to apply those lessons in our work in a rural context as well. But what that means is that often we're a single pillar in this landscape approach, where very little is happening to help hold up the other sections and sectors of the landscape. And we're looking more and more at how we can attract and interface with similar like-minded enterprises, organizations, governance agencies, who, in real time, as a group of businesses, as a group of interventions, can work together to deliver that holistic landscape vision. So, when we're talking about rural areas, we really have to look at agriculture, forestry, livestock, oftentimes fisheries. Those are all of the natural resources that can come under pressure, but those are also all of the natural resources that can provide opportunities. So that's a little bit where we stand at the moment, that, as Gijs mentioned before, we used to come into an area very much on a needs basis, look at all of the different opportunities, think about how we could develop businesses that would support the landscape and the natural resources, and to improve our offering to the people who we work with. We've become much more directed at filling an incredibly small niche, but that means that oftentimes we find ourselves standing alone, and the impacts that we're having directly might be beneficial, and they might be working and being delivered, but the compounding impact and the landscape impact and the safeguarding of an entire system and an ecosystem is much more difficult to ensure. So this is just a little bit about what I just mentioned, but we are becoming narrower and narrower in our approach, and we think that that is the right thing to do, because that's also honest to our customers and the people that we serve, and that's the farmers. We have to become better and better at what we're doing, otherwise we're doing them a disservice. But that means that our solutions and our approach is not applicable in all of the landscape, and landscapes that maybe come across our path. But also that we need to align more closely to similar adjacent organizations who have complementary interests. Yeah, and I think these are just some lessons. I think this might be the last slide, so I'll just leave this here. I think Gijs touched on a few of these in the questions, but we try to start small. We're always trying to scale and see what works and adapt. Invest small amounts of money so that we can keep the larger portion of the capital to scale what has been successful. Yeah, I think the third one, landscapes are incredibly complex. That's what we learn more and more. And when you provide one of these opportunities or one of these pillars that's strong, it can also disproportionately pressure that enterprise. So oftentimes we find that with if we're only looking at a small portion of the population, because we believe that those are the people who deserve real investment for agriculture, that means that a large portion of the population is not included, and that then disproportionately pressures us to potentially scale much more quickly than we would like to, or include people who are not interested in the long term, rather than those people being offered alternative opportunities that are better suited to their interests and their backgrounds. Yeah, real impact requires systems thinking. I don't know, that's one of these things. But yeah, so let's answer some more questions, and we'll try to answer those that we missed before. Chat. Feel free to ask them by voice as well if you'd like to. Let me go up. Okay. One more question. Yeah, Disha, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that presentation, and it was very interesting. It's really useful to have this summary of lessons learned. I think that Raphael also just shared a question around funding of these initiatives at the early stages, like who provides the seed funds as well. That would be quite interesting to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, so with the funding, what we usually do is we have a blended approach. So the startup is usually donor funded, and that's because the development of these business plans until the stage where we have an investable model that we can use to attract impact investors, it takes a bit of time, and we really try to put in the research to understand the local context and make sure that we adapt whatever approach and whatever lessons we've learned elsewhere to fit the landscape that we're in. You know, Gijs mentioned that we've got these different product categories, and those we've thought about those because they fit in these marginal and difficult landscapes, but it's not fixed. It's just where we sit at the moment. So usually we attract donor funding for a startup phase or a development phase, which lasts, in the past it's lasted much longer, but now we're looking at between 6 months and a year, hopefully more towards the 6 months side of the scale as we're working more quickly. And then we attract impact investment funding, and those investors become shareholders in the company along with Grounded as a founding shareholder. I hope that answers fairly enough. And then
I like it if Desha comes up with the questions.
Yeah, maybe,
and then we close the chat screen because we can't see properly.
Yeah, that's fine.
Questions and we don't feel guilty.
That's fine. Yeah, I'll filter. Just going back to Kamal's question earlier about how you choose the crops. I think you've partially already answered this, especially in talking about some of the 80-20 rule. But in terms of existing species grown in the landscape, so indigenous species, do you choose these above introducing new ones? And then part B of that question is around benefit sharing mechanisms.
Oh yeah, that's best price. Best price if you can get a local crop and use that to build a landscape. But for example, in Zambia, we have an amazing nursery, super for two things. It's interesting for the cosmetic industry as a carrier oil. It's super nice as a food crop, not so super popular. It produces like crazy. It can be propagated easily. There has been amazing research done in the 60s with an Israeli professor. So amazing crop, amazing tree crop, so you can reforest an area. So all lies on green, you would say, but you're not allowed to sell the crop in Europe because it's a novelty food. And that is one of the biggest limiting factors for us as working with indigenous plants, is that they're often not allowed to be sold on the international markets. And the local markets often not provide enough space to build a complete business around it. So in that case is what we do, and we actually have a person here in Grounded now who specializes, who did a PhD on this indigenous plants, because we're super passionate about it, because that really allows us to re-bring nature, in its original state and have value out of it. So that's first prize. In South Africa, there's rooibos, buku, honeybush. There's a lot of things that we can use potentially to make an agroforestry system around indigenous plants. But in other countries, much less so. A lot of the products are not allowed to be sold. So we have to have more what we call anchor crops on which we can really build a business case, which we really scale it and which we make money. And then we try to build in these other aspects and those more indigenous plants to improve the company, to make it more resilient, and also to see potentially, if we can get some buffer zones with a mixed agroforestry system that almost mimics the natural areas. It's first prize, and if we can do it, we do it. It's always the first thing we start off with is work with the botanical organizations to see what are the indigenous crops and what is potentially there. Sorry, long question, long answer for maybe an easy question.
Oh, good answer actually. So it's good to actually get that description on the background. Just going back to James's question around establishing a positive relationship between big and big agriculture trading companies. Have you been able to do that?
Yeah.
Between big agricultural trading companies?
Yes.
Yeah, so because, although we work in this regenerative agriculture space, we're still very much towards commercial agriculture that can provide a long-term commercial venture, create a long-term commercial venture. So we do work with big seed suppliers and for other inputs and so on. And because we're within this niche brand sector, we're not really competing on a very high level with big ag, so to speak. So I'm not sure if that exactly, it's a short answer maybe for a more complex question.
No, maybe I can add to that. I think the nice thing is that these bigger organizations feeling the pressure by their customers. In the end, the change is not triggered by companies like Grounded, or maybe it's a combination of the small Grounded, but definitely by the consumers eventually. With every choice a consumer makes, they make a choice for a system. And with more and more better alternatives coming up to the market, that there's more demand, and these bigger companies see change, and they really want to, within these bigger organizations, not everybody, but there are people within these bigger organizations that want to transition to more the regenerative agri-systems. They see the benefits, they understand the complexity, and so that allows us to provide that. For bigger companies to change their value chains is super difficult. But if we can build those value chains for them, together with our landscape partners, we can transform the industry. And again, we don't have an impact. I don't believe individual organizations have an impact. But if we can, I think all the million Groundeds, WWFs, all the organizations all together, the more people join in, the more consumers that go from meat eating to even flexitarian to using natural cosmetics, all of these things will drive, and that market is growing fast. And the younger the generation, the better they are, making better choices. And the internet allows us to be critical, to do our research. And we are, we as an organization are also lifting on that movement, and it's enforcing us and reinforcing them, and that's and the bigger companies have to tap in, and they are super anxious about not being able to follow. You see that big brands are now under threat from these thousands of small artisanal producers, smaller brands. That are just all together taking huge parts of the market, and they are invisible, as a standalone. But if you add all these small natural companies, small artisanal makers, if you add them all up, you see that they take over a huge part of the market over the last decade, or even less so. So it's super impressive. And obviously, I'm biased because I'm in the middle of it and I see it everywhere. But I'm just super passionate about it, and it gives a lot of energy to go into that direction.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. This is something that you do see quite a lot online, especially for high-end products. Is that the case with a lot of the products that you're working with?
Yeah, we definitely, it starts at the top. It starts at the top in when it comes to food, and it moves its way down. But I do believe it will become mainstream, and that's what we're working towards. And also for us, making just reliable quality food that we can serve these bigger companies, because that's one of the biggest hurdles for these bigger companies, is that these regenerative food systems, don't always have the reliability because they're relatively new. We can't always offer the reliability in the beginning because we have setbacks, yields, diseases that we can't treat. But we try to build our companies to that stage that we can deliver to those buyers. And even the big traditional companies, like the Unilevers, they're really pushing for it. They have to go along. So you see that, if you can overcome those hurdles, they want to buy the products. And I think if we become better at making them, and we can become better at regenerative agriculture and try to make it work on a larger scale, we can also cost effectively serve the middle markets. And that's the next step. And I think for some of the things we're already doing that. And it's not just us, it's everybody. So I believe it started top class, but more and more I'm convinced it will. I want to be convinced myself that it goes into that direction. Let me phrase it like that.
Yes, definitely. I agree with that. We are coming close to the end of the hour. Does anyone have any final questions before we conclude?
Yeah, maybe what we can also do is just share in this chat thing our email addresses. So if anybody wants to send us a specific question by email, if they think of something later on, then they're welcome to ask us.
Or if you have critics or comments, I think we need to do things differently.
Yeah.
Perfect, that'd be great. But what we'll do is also host a recording of this on the lab platform, and also share it with the WWF network as well, so that they can offer some additional comments. I think Musa was asking if we can share your presentation. Would that be something that you'd be happy for us to send around as well?
If everybody promised to be critical when commenting, yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. As long as they're not mean.
No, yeah. For Dutchies, it's not. It takes a long time before we consider it mean. So no, for us it's a really nice. Thank you very much, because it provides a good opportunity to share our thinking, and you wouldn't believe how often we change our strategy or change our vision because we see. Because we see it's not perfect and it will never be perfect, but we constantly adapt. And that is because we work with a lot of people that are super critical. Within the NGOs we work with, they criticize everything we do. But of course, in a supporting way. And I think that's what we need at this stage as Grounded.
I agree. I think that's the only way to improve the services, and this is something that we see from the lab's perspective as well. Anything to improve delivery on the ground as well.
I like what James says at the end here. Theory of change becomes more often change of theory, and I think that is very true in our case. So we change our theory as often as we change our underpants. So. Thanks very much, everybody, and for all of the questions and inputs. And follow-up thoughts will be great.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Gijs and Steffi. And yes, we hope to continue the conversation.